Do you believe that Russia is targeting ISIS targets or not?
They're not. They may be targeting some, Chris, but it's interesting. Their initial strikes were against the individuals and the groups that have been funded and trained by our CIA in a incredible flaunting of any kind of cooperation or effort to conceal what their Putin's priority is, and that is, of course, to prop up Bashar Assad. And by the way, I can absolutely confirm to you that they were strikes against our Free Syrian Army or groups that have been armed and trained by the CIA, because we have communications with people there. And so now we're going to have a meeting of the military or some kind of communications. That seems to be the administration's first priority, and so we can stand by and watch them strike those groups that are fighting against Bashar Assad that we are training and funding. This is an Orwellian experience.
The people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. We funded 20 years ago.
Is the United States supporting al-Qaeda in Syria? Reality Check looked at a report by Reuters last week that indicates the answer is yes. So why did an Irish journalist claim that Ben was supporting propaganda in support of Syria's leader? Ben has the Reality Check you won't see anywhere else.
It was Sunday when Anonymous was able to hack the Reuters news service Twitter account. Well, as part of that, they tweeted our Reality Check based on a Reuters article that the Obama administration is secretly providing support to opposition forces in Syria. Here's a clip from that report. But the big question here that no one is asking, who are these rebels that the U.S. is supporting? Well, buried at the bottom of that Reuters article, quote, recent news reports from the region have suggested that the influence and numbers of Islamist militants, some of them connected to al-Qaeda or its affiliates, have been growing among Assad's opponents. In response, a pro-opposition reporter from the Irish Times Online, Mary Fitzgerald, called our story pro-Assad propaganda. So is that true? Are we shilling for Assad? Well, maybe we're just shilling for the truth. Fact number one. There is no question that al-Qaeda fighters are part of the opposition forces attempting to overthrow Syria's government. From the New York Times, July 25th. One Qaeda operative, a 56-year-old known as Abu Thuha, who lives near Kirkuk in Iraq, spoke to an Iraqi reporter from the New York Times on Tuesday. Quote, we have experience now fighting the Americans and more experience now with the Syrian revolution, he said. Our big hope is to form a Syrian Iraqi Islamic State for all Muslims and then announce our war against Iran and Israel and free Palestine. Well, we already know that much of the opposition in Libya to overthrow Gaddafi were al-Qaeda fighters. But if we look at history, none of this is anything new. Fact number two, the creation of al-Qaeda wasn't Islamic fundamentalism. It was the CIA. The Mudjahidines was created by the CIA to cause problems for the Soviets. And you might say that's crazy talk, right? Here's Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
To be fair, we had helped to create the problem we're now fighting. How? Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of Mudjahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan.
So it's not a conspiracy theory, it's history. And it's history that's being repeated in Libya and now in Syria. But there is a bigger problem here, one that every American should be questioning. We're fighting al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but we're also bombing al-Qaeda targets in Pakistan and in Yemen. And as we do that, something occurs known as collateral damage. Hundreds of civilians in Yemen have been killed in just the first half of 2012 by U.S. airstrikes aimed at al-Qaeda fighters. From NPR, In the mid-May strike in Jar, for example, Yemeni officials said 2 militants and 8 civilians were killed. According to residents we spoke with, no militants were killed, but there were 17 to 26 civilian deaths. That was just one of more than 40 documented strikes this year alone. By the way, in that picture right there, that boy is 15 years old, and he was wounded while watching his father and brother die in one of those airstrikes. So what you need to know tonight is heavy. Our government is bombing sites around the world in an ongoing war with al-Qaeda. In Iraq, where al-Qaeda had no presence before the U.S. war, al-Qaeda is now thriving. The same al-Qaeda, yes, created by the U.S. government in order to harm the Soviets. And today, at least 13,000 civilians in Afghanistan are dead as a result of that war with al-Qaeda. So with all respect to Ms. Fitzgerald from the Irish Times, this is not propaganda. Rather, it is the question that every American should be demanding answers on from Congress and from this president. Why are we giving al-Qaeda fighters money and weapons to overthrow yet another government in the Middle East? Today, our government claims they're freeing the people of Syria. Tomorrow, if history tells us anything, we will be killing and wounding civilians in airstrikes and then referring to them as collateral damage in a war with an enemy who we brought to power. And that is Reality Check.
Americans argue over whether or not to go to war from the safety of their homes. But what do the people who we invade and occupy think? Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. When the U.S. invades a country, we often only hear about it through stories about our soldiers and commanders, and not through the eyes of those being occupied. Joining me now is Anand Gopal, one of the very few foreign journalists to have embedded with the Taliban. He's the author of No Good Men Among the Living, which recounts the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan through Afghan eyes. Welcome, Anand.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first, in your book, No Good Men Among the Living, you draw attention to the impact of U.S. policies in Afghanistan all the way back to the Cold War. And I'm wondering if you can trace those policies. How did such policies allow eventually for the emergence of the Taliban?
Well, when the Soviet Union invaded in 1979, resistance was sparked because of this. And the U.S., particularly the CIA, flooded Afghanistan with guns and weapons and created what's called the Mudjahidines, or the Islamic holy fighters. And this also created warlordism. So the warlords that we see today in Afghanistan originate back in 1979. There's no warlordism before then in the country. And so these Islamic radicals and these warlords have been fighting ever since, and it's been in that chaos that the Taliban originally arose.
Now, we're supposed to be drawing down the Afghan war, but because of bilateral agreements signed between the U.S. and Afghanistan and President Obama quietly extending the war, it's not clear if, in fact, we are withdrawing. What is the attitude of Afghans, ordinary Afghans, to the U.S. troops and what they see as an occupation that may have no end?
Well, Afghans are divided on this question, and in many ways that reflects the fact that the country itself is divided into two parts. The war is only being fought in about half of the country, in the south and in the east. And the other half of the country is mostly at peace. So if you talk to Afghans there, in the areas that are at peace, many of them will say, you know what, we'd rather the troops stay in Afghanistan as a buffer against future civil war or the rise of the Taliban into their areas. But if you talk to Afghans in the areas where the war is being fought, most of them will tell you that they're tired of the fighting and they don't want troops there because they see troops as part of the reason why there is so much violence.
So the U.S. has spent over $1 trillion on the war in Afghanistan. In your view, what has all that money accomplished?
If you go to Afghanistan, if you travel through the countryside, one of the most shocking things is just how underdeveloped the country is and remains, despite the fact that the U.S. has actually spent more money in Afghanistan than it did in the entire Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. That's just a staggering amount of money, and most of that money has not reached ordinary Afghans. It's gone into the coffers of major corporations, it's gone into the hands of warlords, strongmen, private security companies. A lot of it has gone to Dubai, but roads are still in a state of disrepair. There are schools that are abandoned. People don't have electricity. The level of infrastructure in this country is one of the worst in the world, and that's staggering considering the fact that we've probably spent more money in Afghanistan than we have in any other country in the world.
So over the years that you have been reporting from Afghanistan, what sort of changes have you seen in the day-to-day lives of ordinary people, particularly marginalized populations like women and children?
In 2001, Afghanistan had already been at war for about 2 decades. There were no jobs, there was a massive refugee crisis, and there was a sense that maybe with the United States coming, a lot of these things would change. But instead, what you've seen is more of the same, another decade of war. And so the hope that was there in the early years is gone, and it's been replaced by cynicism. And many of the Afghans that I speak to who had returned to the country from Pakistan or Iran, where they were refugees, and tried to build a life, now they're looking to leave again, because from their point of view, there is no end in sight. Not only is there the Taliban and US forces, there are also warlords, there are also a host of militias that the US is supporting, hundreds of thousands of people with guns who are fighting on one side or the other, and civilians are the ones who are caught in between these two.
So what do you expect for Afghanistan's future, with or without US troops? How are ordinary Afghans going to deal with these warlords that are in power in the government, forces like the Taliban as an unofficial army on the ground? Do you foresee that Afghanistan may be a country where you could see the rise of new militant organizations like we've seen in Iraq?
There are already new militant organizations that are arising. There are splinter groups coming out of the Taliban who are more radical than anything we've seen in the Taliban. They're small right now, but it's certainly a growing phenomenon, and that's born out of the fact that there's been no end in sight to the fighting. On the one hand, on the Afghan government side, you have private security contractors, the Afghan army, the Afghan police, and warlords, and if you add it all up, that's almost 350,000 men under arms who are being paid for by the United States to fight on the US's behalf. So in other words, a massive proxy army. On the other hand, you have tens of thousands of Taliban fighters, many of them are farmers by day and pick up the gun by night, and they're supported by Pakistan. Their leadership has safe haven in Pakistan, and you can consider them also a proxy army of Pakistan. So you have what's essentially a proxy war. It's in that milieu that you see some of the even more radical tendencies coming out.
So would you say that the US's policies in Afghanistan have had a ripple effect with unintended consequences as far away as northern Iraq and Syria, with groups like ISIS coming about, and within Afghanistan as well, that US policy has really directly fueled the rise of these movements?
If you look back over the last 30 years, it's certainly the case that US policy in Afghanistan and its counterterrorism policy in general has fanned the flames of insurgency and jihad. Many of the leaders of al-Qaeda got their sort of start in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Afghanistan at the time was a magnet for jihadis, and it was so in part because there was so much money and guns floating around because of the CIA's patronage of the Mudjahideen. And that was the start of it. And if you look at Iraq, groups like ISIS only exist because of the chaos that was sown by the US invasion in 2003 and the subsequent civil war. None of these groups would have come about if it weren't for that. And so US policy in Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world is actually continuing to create the very enemies that it purports to fight.
So you just returned, I understand, from northern Iraq and Syria. And what are people on the ground in those countries saying about ISIS? What sort of support is there or lack of? And what sort of attitudes do you see, for example, among the Iraqi National Army and Syrian rebel groups?
Well, in Iraq, I had a chance to speak to people from all sections of society. And one thing that I found is that while ISIS is extremely unpopular, and understandably so given how brutal they are, I did not meet a single Sunni Iraqi who did not view ISIS as equally bad to the Iraqi government. In fact, all the Sunni Iraqis I met viewed ISIS as a lesser of two evils to the Iraqi government and to the Shia militias, who are doing really the same things that ISIS is doing. The Shia militias, whom the US is backing and Iran is also backing, they're beheading people, they're torturing people. You can actually go on YouTube and see some of their videos. In the West, we don't tend to focus on the Shia militias because they tend to be our guys. We tend to focus on ISIS, but from the point of view of people, let's say in Anbar province, they actually view ISIS as a lesser of two evils to the Shia militias, and that's really a tragedy if things have gotten so bad that a group like ISIS can be seen as a lesser of two evils.
Anand, how can Americans see the wars that we allow in our names through the eyes of ordinary Afghans, Iraqis, the people who are on the other ends of our policies?
Well, I think to start with, we need more reporting on the lives of Afghans and Iraqis and others. You know, there's a lot in the news about Afghans and Iraqis, but they tend to be nameless and faceless. They tend to be the object of our attention, but we need to make them the subject of our reporting. You know, we need to actually talk to Iraqis and Afghans and get their experiences, because the world looks very different when you talk to them. The occupations and the wars look very different. And you know, in my travels through southern Afghanistan, I had my worldview change in many respects by talking to Afghans, and who gave me a very different perspective on what the fighting was about. And I would have never gotten that if I didn't have a chance to talk to them. So I think we need to make them a center of our reporting.
Well, Anand, thank you for all the work you do and for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
On the next episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, we'll talk with Heidi Bogosian, who'll take us through the expansion of the security state. It has gotten so large that private companies can now rent it for their own purposes.
Private corporations aren't bound by the U.S. Constitution. So the kind of spying, the in-depth monitoring that they can and do conduct on activists and ordinary Americans is really without oversight and without the kind of rules that government intelligence agencies are supposed to follow.
The released video has shed more light on foreign military aid to ISIL Takfiri militants in Iraq. According to Iraqi media, the video released by the Iraq-based Hezbollah brigades shows a U.S. Chinook helicopter dropping 2 boxes full of weapons for ISIL militants by flying at a low altitude in the Al-Abbar area south of Fallujah. The video has been recorded on February the 9th. Earlier, there were reports that some U.S. helicopters landed in Fallujah, which is the main base of Takfiri militants in Iraq. The reports fueled speculation that the U.S. is providing militants with weapons. That prompted Iraqi lawmakers to urge the government to open an investigation into that matter.
These survival playing cards from Conflicted, the game. Not only can you use them as regular playing cards, they also have preparedness scenarios for you to discuss with your friends and family. It's one of the most affordable ways to get mentally and emotionally prepared, ready for what's about to come. That's conflictedthegame.com. Click the link below right now. Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're tuning into AMTV, Alternative Media Television. It is Thursday, February, and Greece is burning into a big pile of shit, and it's just awesome. The Eurozone is collapsing. The people of Greece are suffering, obviously, so it's on its way out. It's a Grexit, it's an exit, it's assured. It's not a 50% probability, folks. It's 100% probability. But you know what? A lot of people aren't interested in that. They're more interested in ISIS at the moment. You know, the Israeli Strategic Intelligence Service or the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. ISIS, ISIL, the new boogeyman that Obama is promoting. You know, is it possible that ISIS is a creation of the CIA or the Pentagon or the National Spying Agency or perhaps Mossad overseas in Israel? In fact, that's the exact accusation being made by the president of Sudan, the head of Hezbollah. They say it's just a creation of the State Department, just like Al-Qaeda was, just like Al-Qaeda. And I thought Osama bin Laden was dead. I thought Obama had stomped out the evildoer. I thought they kicked his dead body, his carcass, off a U.S. warship in order to give him a proper Muslim burial. They didn't take a photograph. They didn't even do a tweet pic or send it out on Vine. Of course, there's no DNA evidence, not a shred of proof, even though it cost taxpayers the war post-George W. Bush era over $1 trillion+. Thousands of American lives, tens of thousands of people wounded on false pretenses. Remember, it was George W. Bush's WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be total bullshit, turned out to be a falsehood, turned out to be a lie. And you can't help but beg the question, what if ISIS is the same thing? It's Obama's equivalent of Bush's Al-Qaeda in weapons of mass destruction because it justifies a further war in the Middle East. In fact, isn't it curious how the first beheading of Jim Foley, the majority of the American public didn't want a war? They were over it. They were demanding a withdrawal, which was the promise of Barack Obama, only to switch their opinion. A recent CNN and CNBC poll says they now overwhelmingly support it because of the violence that's being portrayed in the mainstream media of ISIS. What started with kind of a docile beheading of Jim Foley has escalated and amplified to multiple beheadings on a Libyan beach of Coptic Christians, women being gang raped, children being slaughtered, people being thrown off of buildings. I even read a report that they're harvesting people's organs and selling it on the black market. I mean, these people really are the boogeyman. They're so friggin' creepy, and it's tough to argue with that. Now Americans support the wars. They're not just behind the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a continuation of what we saw with George W. Bush, but they approve of the drone strikes in Syria. In fact, it justifies an entire war, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, pushing Putin into a corner. You know, what if the U.S. is just using ISIS, dropping them guns and weapons and funding them, etc., so that it fulfills their own effort, their own destabilization effort in this part of the world? Places like Syria, where they've been trying to oust Bashar al-Assad for some time now, they even engineered a false flag, a chemical Gouda attack, which they blamed or tried to blame on Assad, only to come out later. The truth was it was more than likely the rebels on the ground, the terrorists, the United States had been arming, that were more than likely responsible for the gas attack. Isn't it interesting how all of this conveniently just runs right into the laps, falls right into the laps of U.S. politicians to push their agenda for war, just like George W. Bush. Again, they never provide us with a shred of evidence. Just because Obama says it doesn't make it true. I mean, why do we hold this guy to a different standard? Why aren't we allowed to investigate the truth or think outside the box critically? I mean, if you even question ISIS and their legitimacy, you must be also a terrorist, according to this government. You know, Obama has baseless claim after baseless claim, whether or not it was North Korea is responsible for the Sony hack. Isn't it curious how he's also using that as a push for internet censorship, another executive order, or it's bypassing a Congress through illegal immigration, or it's any of these wars and a continuation of these wars overseas. Again, ISIS, I kind of think that the president of Sudan might be onto something, that the leader of Hezbollah might be onto something, that just like Al-Qaeda, ISIS has probably been created by the U.S. State Department, U.S. intelligence agencies here in the United States of America. In fact, I watched an interesting video yesterday, courtesy of Press TV, which showed allegedly a U.S. helicopter dropping supplies to ISIL to give them weapons so they can go kill more people. Again, this is classic propaganda, folks. You demonize the enemy so they're easier to kill, and then you use it to serve your own agenda. It's just like the United States helped to promote the attack on Pearl Harbor by implementing the embargo on Japan before the outbreak of World War II because it justified the United States getting involved in a world war. We're doing the same thing now. We're just blaming ISIS. I mean, how can you argue with beheadings? How can you argue with the raping and the pillaging of women and the murder of children? How can you argue with any of this? And the answer to the question is you can't. That's why it's a perfect tool. That's why it's psychological warfare. It's being engineered to impregnate into the people's minds of America, and not just around the world, that this is why we must go to war. It's not the same thing with the Charlie Hebdo attack. It just pushes that anti-Muslim agenda, this war against evil and the good guy. Here in the United States, we're always the good guy, you know? We always got like a little angel cap on and angel wings. We're like the choir boy, you know, of the world. We're always good. Obama's so good, but everyone else is evil. You know, Putin is the next Hitler. ISIS is the devil. You know, the rest of the world is Satan, but the U.S., we're good. Yeah, that's right. Again, you know what? President Sudan's probably right. The leader of Hezbollah's probably right. The only terrorism and the only terrorist responsible for what's happening in the Middle East is probably coming from the State Department, probably coming from the United States federal government to serve our own agenda, to push a narrative of war, a continuation of these wars in the Middle East. And it's all boiling over.
A rare glimpse of a remote-controlled killer, a pilotless U.S. drone in the skies over Pakistan's tribal belt. The targets are suspected militants, and many senior Taliban and al-Qaeda commanders have been killed. Washington refuses to admit it's using the missiles here. Opponents claim what's happening is murder. These men have lost 8 relatives between them. The dead were guilty of nothing, they say. except living in the wrong place. Sadullah also lost both legs, one eye, and his hope for the future. I wanted to be a doctor, he told me, but I can't walk to school anymore. When I see others going, I wish I could join them. Viewed from a drone, any man in the tribal areas can look like a target, says the Pakistani lawyer taking on the CIA.
Taliban or non-Taliban would be dressed in the same way. Everyone would be having a beard, a turban and an AK-47 because every person carries weapons in that area. So anyone could be targeted.
The British legal charity Reprieve is gathering evidence about the hidden victims of this covert war.
But you know what really tugs at my heartstrings with this particular bit of metal is it was fired in August of last year and almost certainly was the missile that killed a small child up in Waziristan. And I have a 3-year-old son myself, and the idea that this thing killed someone very much like my little wolf really tugs at your heartstrings.
Protesters have taken to the streets in Islamabad, clamouring for justice from Pakistan's courts and its government, which turns a blind eye to the drones.
The message here is that as well as killing innocent people, drone attacks are counterproductive. Campaigners warn that they generate more radicalism, more hatred of the West. They say the drone strikes are a Taliban recruiting tool.
But Washington will probably be unmoved by all this. Increasingly, drones are its weapon of choice.
The president of Sudan has warned that the fight against jihadist extremism must engage militants on an ideological level and not solely concentrate on military action against them. Omar al-Bashir warned that simply using violence against young radicals who fight with organizations like ISIL and al-Qaeda could lead to even more extremism.
Our policy has been largely successful. After we arrest these young people, we bring a group of young scholars to engage in dialogue with them about their thoughts. And we succeed in bringing a lot of them back from their radical ideas.
He says the CIA and Mossad are behind Boko Haram and ISIL. He was speaking exclusively to Euronews in the week that ISIL released a video purporting to show the execution of 21 Egyptians.
I said CIA and the Mossad stand behind these organizations. There is no Muslim who would carry out such acts.
The full interview with Omar al-Bashir will be broadcast on the Global Conversation on Euronews this Wednesday.